Have you ever wondered aloud what happened to the promises of African independence? Prior to independence, if you go back in time, if you cast your mind back in time, if you open history books, you see that prior to the continent attaining independence from colonial superpowers, from their colonial masters, right? There were promises made not by the colonialists, but by indigenous African people. Indigenous African leaders made promises to their people, and they made the people believe that once you extricate Africa from colonial superpower domination, the entire continent was going to experience this sort of rejuvenation, renaissance. Africa is going to be for Africans. And African economy is going to experience a boom, and the African people will live in a better condition. It was more like promises of the land of milk and honey. And because of these promises, we see that Africans went through a state of utter euphoria, utter excitement. There was this sense of absolute optimism that Africa was on the right course. Africa was going to supersede and overshadow the rest of mankind, right? By us getting independence. The reality on the ground was not the case. So we're asking, what happened? Where did Africa go wrong? Where did the leaders go wrong? Why was the sense of general disillusionment, disappointment, pessimism after independence? What happened? This is what we're trying to decode on today's episode. This is the Primordial Wave, and I am the Wisdomizer. Please subscribe to my channel so that each time we put out any content or any lecture, you have the privilege of being part of the discussion in this forum. Click the subscription button and share our channel. Again, we are talking of the promises of African independence and the disillusionment that came after independence. And we're trying to decode, we're trying to decipher what led to that sense of total general failure in African economic and political institutions. The failure that Africa continues to struggle up to today. Africa has not gotten out of the post-colonial, the immediate post-colonial failures. And we have come to pin some specific situations, circumstances down that led to this sense of confusion that pervaded the entire African socio-political and economic arena following independence. We know that before independence, prior to independence, well, let me backtrack. African independence came after the World War II, right? It was after World War II that many countries across the world, not just in Africa, but in South America, in Asia, in Middle East, and in Africa, all these countries and races of people that have been under the domination of European imperialism began for the first time to seek independence. And the ideology of freedom spread like wildfire across the world, right? And particularly in Africa, we see that independence movement was sort of triggered by some radicals, educated radicals, if you may, from West Africa. And that spread quickly across the entire African continent, right? But something was going on after World War II, right? What led to this sense of quest for independence was that Europe was devastated by war psychologically. Europe was destroyed. So I believe that Europe did not have the strong economic and military strength to maintain this global expansionism, right? And there were Africans who fought side by side, if you may, or who were part of the soldiers that fought in the Second World War. And for the first time, they interacted as soldiers with the quote unquote, the superior white man. And they saw that the white man is as human as any person, that probably wasn't the strongest person in the battlefield. So this sense of contact, understanding led to Africans clamoring to be free. It was one of the factors, not the entirety of the factor, but one of the factors that led to Africans saying, well, we can have our own freedom, we can have our own independence. They fought with on the side of the Western society during World War II, right? And they assisted tremendously. And these are part of the stories that Western media hardly carry. So after World War II, Europe was psychologically and economically devastated. So they did not have the political strength, the economic strength, and the military strength to continue their global conquest, the imperial colonial empire was at a decline following World War II. So, and that led to global international agitation for emancipation from the various countries that Europe has dominated for many years. And as I said, in Southeast Asia, in South America, in the Middle East, and particularly in the homeland Africa. So this movement so quickly spread all over the place. But then now Africans began to get independence gradually, one country at a time, and the entire continent was emancipated. But between the end of World War II until recently, 1990, early 1990, something was going on. And that was the Cold War. The Cold War was one of the factors that led to the manipulation of African leaders into total failure. And I'm going to tell you how that happened. Our African leaders were manipulated to take side in this economic, ideological, and political war, hidden covert war between East and the West, communism and capitalism, between Anglo-European establishment and the Eastern Bloc communist society, you know. So this war was going on, and Africa becomes like a hot cake. Both Russia, China, on the one hand, representing the communist Marxist movement, and the Western society representing capitalist movement, we are looking for allies in Africa. And these young, naive, who think the African leaders who think they were educated, were taking sides on these ideological wars, and they were manipulated. And oftentimes we've seen that Russia, Cuba, and the Chinese government were highly involved, either covertly or overtly, in tricking these young, dynamic, eloquent African nationalists into taking sides with them. And because of this battle, the Cold War battle, African leaders became split into two divisive ideological sects. On the one side, you have the conservatives who are very sympathetic towards the Western orientation, right? And on the other hand, you had the radical leftist, Leninist, Marxist, socialist, communist, if you want, African leaders who were sympathetic to the orientation of communism and socialism, right? And because these African leaders were very naive, they're very naive because most of them were Western educated and there was no indigenous philosophy, you know, because what guides any strong political movement is if that movement or that ideology is organically developed. Africa did not have an organically developed political ideology to utilize to fight the almighty imperialistic powers or empires. Not at all, right? So what happened is that African leaders were trying to utilize capitalism to fight imperial capitalism, right? And on the other hand, they were trying to utilize socialism or communism to fight imperialism of communism and socialism. And you cannot beat somebody in the game he developed. You can't do that, right? Because he's the one, if I develop a game, I know the ins and outs of the game. And you cannot overshadow me in my own game. You cannot overshadow capitalist Western society utilizing the tools they've taught you in school because they are the owner of the tool, right? So this is one of the factors that led to infighting between African leaders. Kwame Nkrumah, for example, was seen as a Marxist revolutionary, as a socialist, and that made him a target of the Western society. There were other people like Houphouët Boigny of Ivory Coast, right, who was seen by the Western society as a great ally because he was a conservative right wing. You know, he was the kind of guy who said, "Well, let's not rush this independent stuff. Let's take it easy. Let's let's allow the Western world, to still continue to live in our country, and we're going to take it easy." Kwame Nkrumah is the kind of person who will say, "No, Africa is for the Africans. White man, you got to live now, not tomorrow. Now, right?" Again, some other factors that led to Africans not being able to deliver on the promises of independence was that there were few trained administrators in Africa at that time. Take, for instance, Congo. I think Congo has maybe less than 16 college graduates during independence. That's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. So the clamor for independence was huge. But when you look at the structure, the indigenous ideological structure that could supported that movement, we discovered that it was weak. Zambia, when that country obtained independence, has maybe 100 plus college graduates with no, that's ridiculous, with no administrative experience. You see? So even though these people have gotten independence, but they were still under the grip of colonial superpowers, right? Because the West could not have completely left. They were still there remotely controlling the continent. And that is what many people have come to regard as neo-colonialism. So, and because the few elites who were educated, who were excited before independence, these guys were young, dynamic, intelligent, right? Articulate. But as I said, they did not have an indigenous ideological philosophy that could have driven them to maintain a strong, to retain their promises of independence. They didn't have it at all. It was not there. So most of the promises they made they didn't know what they were talking about. It was just like a catchphrase, it was a catchphrase. And because of that, the West and the Eastern Bloc, communism and capitalism, dominated the African leaders' thought process, and they could not deliver to their people. And we see in the 1970s through the 1980s, there were massive corruption in Africa. It was as if Africa was a total mess, was a total collapse. We see military adventurism into power politics. We see coups and counter coups, death, uh, wars. You know, that Africa was, as a continent, was almost like a failed continent, both in the northern region as well as the sub-Sahara African regions, particularly in the sub-Saharan African regions, and the trials of wars, of starvation, of poverty. And then in the 1970s, you see the epidemic of AIDS, HIV, ravaging the continent. And one is wondering, as when I read textbooks, history books, I ask myself, what happened to the promises of independence? What happened? And the corruption of the 70s and 80s has come to shape the psychology of a lot of Africans. I'm not talking of leaders, because the problem is that when you talk of corruption in Africa, many people look at the leaders. The reality is that leader came out of you. The leader is a part of you. The leader came out from your midst. So the leader is thinking like you do. So, and because of this psychological and moral damage, so it is difficult to reorientate the minds of an African to understand that politics is not a place to acquire wealth. Politics is a place to serve the people, to serve your people. And being a politician doesn't mean you have to be rich. In fact, you have to be poor when you're a politician, unless you have a second job. And we know many politicians in other countries have a second, maybe they are farmers, because if you depend on what you're being paid, you don't get paid much money. You don't get paid enough money, you know. So to sustain yourself, so many people have to go and get a second job. But in places like Africa, I see that once somebody is made a governor, it means that you have succeeded. Your family and your family have succeeded. You see governors building hotels and building these economic yielding infrastructures that they will lean on when they leave office, right? So that psychology is not just the leaders. That psychology, the psychology that has been embedded within our collective consciousness. And it is very difficult to extricate such mentality from the people. And such mentality came as a result of the failures and failures upon failures of the African leaders. So I am going to share a screen. We can talk on this. We can continue to discuss on the failures of the African promises of independence. So we are going to look at this topic from 3 points of view. One is pre-independence euphoria, as I have stated, optimism. Before independence, there was a sense of happiness, you know, of joy, of just this optimism. We are going to be free from colonial domination and from colonial masters. And once the white man go, the white man is our problem. Once the white man leaves, we are free and we have economic abundance. We no longer answer yes sir, no sir. We become our own bosses, right? That was the thinking. That was the process, the mentality. And we see some of these nationalists, including lots of African writers at that time. When you read their writings about decolonization, it was brilliant. You see the sense of excitement in them, right? You see the sense of general and total absolute optimism, right, in their writings, whether they are writing fiction, whether they are writing newspapers or any kind of political or social narrative. You see that sense of general optimism in the Africans. You know, we believe that once we kick the ass of the white people and they leave the continent, we are free. But that wasn't the case, because again, once the white men left, what happened was that Africa became again under the domination of a new kind of elite. And these elites were all friends of the West. And the West saw them as their lackeys. So they were utilizing them to continue their endless exploitation of African resources throughout African continent. So the new elite who were quote unquote educated in the Western ideologies or in the Eastern ideologies became the new demigods in the continent. They became the new masters. They become the new rulers. And as they say, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So these leaders became absolute kings. They became absolute dictators. And from that point, you see the fight to gain control of power in the African governments. And you see coups and counter coups, democratically elected governments being on seat, military powers coming to power, and another military coup counterize their own coup and overthrow them, and over and over and over throughout from late 70s until recently, right? So that was the situation in Africa, right? So let's talk about the pre-independence optimism or euphoria. From the end of the World War II to the early 1970s was the period of overinflated optimism about independence of African countries. Few years after World War II, only Liberia, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa has attained independence. The end of World War II created an international anti-colonial movement all over Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, and the Middle East, as well as through the Caribbean, right? European superpowers at this time has depleted their economic strength and were unable to effectively maintain colonialism across the planet, right? So Europe went through a period of psychological depression after years of war, campaign, and propaganda. You know, World War II sucked all the resources that European countries have managed to steal from Africa, you know, through their colonial adventurism. They squandered their money fighting wars, fighting among themselves, right? And after World War II, they were broke. Germany was devastated. England was broke. And anyone who understands history know that the United States of America began to be a superpower after World War II because the old world, the imperial expansionist European societies and countries had collapsed following the war, right? So that was the moment America picked up the battle, the baton, and became the torchbearer, became the world superpower. So Americans' leadership in the world is recently new, so to say, was following the collapse of Germany in 1945. So it was because Europe was broke and they could no longer maintain this global expansionism. That's where when African intellectuals who have studied side by side in the Western society began to challenge the colonial establishment. But the problem was that in the motherland Africa, colonialists were so intelligent that they did not really train African administrators. What did they train? Church ministers, right? Chefs, clerks, and drivers. These people who are like kind of Negro, yes sir, no sir. They didn't train really the population of Africans in terms of political philosophy, in terms of economics. They did not want to train them to that level. It's only a select few people who were outstanding that they trained in terms of actual education. The rest were only servants. And these people could not run governments. They could not be administrators after independence, right? And that led to that general disillusionment that came after independence, right? So now, the struggle for independence came and went. Many African countries eventually got their independence, and yay, we're free. Uhuru, we're free. Freedom has come at last, right? But then that was not the end of the story. Between 1970 and 1980, Africans have come to understand that independence promises were false. Bloody civil wars, conflicts, and corruptions had ravaged the continent. This was the period of persistent military adventure into power politics between 1966 and 1993. There were over 60 recorded military coups in Africa, you know. And it wasn't that these military coups were not going on in other parts of the world, like Southeast Asia. It was going all over the world. But the African type was unique in the sense that in one country you have multiple military coups, and when this military establishment and officers come to power, they don't have agenda. There was no agenda but to perpetuate themselves into power. You know, they did not have a mapped out program of developing the people. And even if they did, it was usually under Marxist philosophy. And because they came under Marxist philosophy, they became the enemies of the Western world. If you want to destroy yourself, just claim to be a Marxist or begin to preach Marxist philosophy. The Western society will do whatever to take you out. And we have seen in the case of Thomas Sankara, right? As brilliant as that gentleman was, but he was a Marxist. I'm not a fan of Marxism. I know many people won't forgive me for saying this because he's a darling of many people. And I understand the young man was intelligent. He was brilliant. He was eloquent, right? But he was a kind of Marxist socialist. And personally, I do not agree to Marxist Leninism or communism in any form. It's not I'm a Republican by nature, you know, I'm a Republican. But anyway, so news from Africa was full of post-independence armed guerrilla struggles, warlords, child soldiers, poverty, hunger, and starvation, which became the image of Africa in the international world up to today. Many people across the world, when they think of Africa, what do they think about? Is war and starvation, right? That has become the identity of Africa and Africans, right? That image came between 1970 and 1980s and maybe mid 90s, right? So, but that image has created a negative perception of the entire African continent, and all over the world, Africans are looked down based on the perception of 1980s, right? So, both the military and the civilian political elites were massively corrupt. You know, they're all the same, corrupt, economic and political corruption. So politics and power became for the elites a means of primitive accumulation of material wealth. By 1986, many African countries were ranked extremely low income countries. Leaders lacked the ability to develop clear post-colonial sustainable economic what was I writing here? Leaders lacked the ability to develop clear post-colonial sustainable economy free of exportation of cash crops. They didn't develop anything. What the African leaders, post-colonial African leaders did was that they discovered a treasure, and that treasure was that Africa is full of resources. So they begin to just export those cash crops and sell without looking inward and developing a sustainable economic infrastructure that will lead the continent to the future. And that is part of the failure that we experience in Africa today, where we have visionless leaders, leaders who think that semi-primitive, I say semi-illiterate in terms of global economic understanding, very ignorant. And those leaders cannot compete with the smart Chinese leaders or any leaders across the world. And that is the reason why African leaders become like beaches to these other brilliant leaders across the world, because they come to Africa to fuck African leaders up, and they don't even know that. And even if they know, because of their primitive drive and instinct to acquire money by any means necessary, they can pawn the entire continent. They can sell the entire continent. They don't care. All they care is to have big mansions and big money banked across the world. They don't care. They don't understand group economics. They don't understand that if you, as a people, don't rise politically, technologically, culturally, you are not respected anywhere in the world, as we have seen that Africans are not respected anywhere in the world. If you go to China, you see how poorly Africans are treated, and that reflects how how these people interact with other people, other leaders around the world. They interact on a position of subservient. People with no knowledge, people with no technological knowledge. To build anything, you have to run to them to come and help you. And you have engineers all over the place. You have to call Julius Berger to come and construct simple bridge. You know that a people have evolved. I'm talking of evolved mental evolution. People have left the Stone Age primitive mindset when you look at the type of infrastructure, because we're talking of geometry. Geometry is spirituality. And for you to build any infrastructure means you have to have that divine geometrical knowledge. And any society where geometry, by way of infrastructure, technology, and engineering, is not strong, that tells you that society is still operating within the primitive mind. Plain and simple. So now, again, post-independence disappointment, the disillusionment that came after independence. By the middle of 1980s, African political and economic institutions have been woefully mismanaged. The entire continent was in shambles. 77% of African countries ranked poorest in the Human Development Index. Economic growth rate was shamefully the poorest in the world. Unemployment, lack of access to education, healthcare, transportation, and other basic amenities were non-existent, not functioning, or poorly functioning. This is very important. This is very important. This led to the gate of this led to the agenda of the United Nations, World Health Organizations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and other nefarious government NGOs being opened in Africa. What do I mean by this? Because around the world, the African continent has now been seen as the misery of the world, the pauper of the planet. So everybody has to go and save Africa, redeem Africa from their misery, from their suffering, from their woes, right? And this led to nefarious activities. We see the International Monetary Fund lending money to Africans with high interest rates, right? And this interest rate will cripple Africa for years, right? And begin to dominate in a new form of enhanced neocolonialism, right? The World Health Organization begin to bring all these medications, we're vaccinating Africans, giving you all kinds of things. We see the outbreak of AIDS pandemic in the 1970s. And if you study many independent researchers, they will tell you that in the 1978-ish, when AIDS epidemic was first made known in Africa, in African continent, that whatever caused HIV/AIDS was in the vaccine that the World Health Organization brought to Africa. And this is what nobody wants to touch because it's a sacred topic. Before 19, before the 70s, there was no HIV. And suddenly we see the outbreak of these deadly diseases that ravaged the African continent. And some people say it was a depopulation agenda of these internationalists, of these globalists, of these satanic, Luciferian, evil, diabolical people. Because Africa was reduced to a level of being a beggar. The leaders went around the world shamelessly begging, oh, come and help us, we need your vaccine. And then when they borrow your money, they give you conditions that go with that money. You have to begin to create, what do they call this program? Family planning, green revolution. These were Malthusian ideologies. These were mass depopulation agendas in the world. And because they're giving you the money, they give you the money and they dictate what you do to get their money. And usually what you do is to vaccinate your people and to depopulate your people under World Health Organization, right? Right? So Africa was fucked up, and the independent leaders were not prepared to lead Africa into the next phase of civilization. All their promises were facade. All their promises and euphoria was nonsensical, did not make sense. They just ended up hyping the masses up. And then after they now have independence, what did they do with it? They didn't have the administrative skill to govern themselves locally, not to talk of having the sophistication to deal with the nefarious, evil internationalists who are leading, who are set to lead Africa astray and exploit their resources, right? So now, after independence, Kwame Nkrumah became a visible voice from, first of all, from sub-Saharan African, from West Africa, and then his influence spread all over Africa. This guy was a superstar. Kwame Nkrumah was very influential. People liked him because he was a brilliant. And I heard that when he was in school, he was spent all his time studying. So he was read. He was read and brilliant, more brilliant than many African leaders at that time. So he was a very intimidating kind of guy because he knows how to rally the masses. He told the people what they wanted to hear, right? You know, independence now, you know. So now the CIA, American Central Intelligence Agency, set an eye on him. And, you know, when CIA comes after you, you're not going to survive it, you know, because you don't have an indigenous intelligence network to neutralize the almighty influence of CIA when they want to get you, because they are going to use their own inner cycle to take you out. And that was what happened. Kwame Nkrumah was dethroned. He went into exile, and he died like a miserable person. So Nkrumah was waxing strong, first in West African countries and throughout Africa. And the Western intelligentsia were watching him. They're watching, just as they watched Thomas Sankara, just as they watched Patrice Lumumba. You know, they were set an eye on him, watching him, because Nkrumah stepped out of Ghana and was beginning to form a political alliance with other leftist radical in sub-Saharan Africa. And their influence began to go to North Africa. And then the CIA was like, oh, wait a minute. If we don't stop this guy, he's going to really affect the Western societies and their geopolitical strategies negatively. So they begin to follow him around. So in 1958, Ghana, led by Kwame Nkrumah, as well as Guinea under Sekou Toure, formed a Ghana-Guinea Union. This union was not just a union, it was a union of the leftists, African leftists, because at this point, the European colonial manipulators have divided Africa into two, African leaders into two camps. You know, Westerners know how to, it's called divide and conquer. On the one hand, you have the conservative, whether in the Francophone establishment or in the Anglophone establishment. You have these two ideological camps. The conservative, slow-going, Western-leaning people, and then you have the radical who are anti-West, if you may, and sometimes pro-communist or pro-Russia, pro-USSR, right? So Ghana and Guinea formed the Ghana-Guinea Alliance. Later on, I think a year or two after, Mali under Modibo Keeper joined the alliance. So Nkrumah was the brainchild behind this move. His main intention was to gradually form an all-African political alliance of the leftist bloc, and which would protect his vision of Pan-Africanist ideology under socialist system. Nkrumah was a socialist. Socialist. I'm not a fan of socialism, even though many Africans think that, oh, African society is naturally socialism. They were saying this because South Africa don't have strong philosophical ideology of which to pin down their political, their indigenous political establishment is not there. So they borrow from here and borrow from here and then try to join them. And oftentimes it ends up being extremely capitalist or extremely socialist. And none of them survived, right? So in 1961, Sekou Toure, another leftist radical, led a conference of radical leftist revolutionaries under the name the Casablanca Group, which was held in Morocco. You know, from forming Ghana, Guinea, Mali alliance to the Casablanca Group. So they are spreading to Morocco, the northern part of Africa, and the CIA was watching. These CIA thugs were watching, and they wanted to make sure that that movement does not, because they saw it as a communist. Because you have to understand what was going on at that time was a fight between communism and communism and capitalism, between the East and the West. It was a time of Cold War, right? So the world intelligentsias, whether it's KGBI or the Chinese intelligence or the Cuban intelligence or the American, Western, Anglo-British, European, American establishment, they were all watching. Their spies are all over the world. And anyone who's doing something that resembles like communism, you know, they come after you. They come after you and they will kill you. They will kill you like a chicken. They don't care, right? So they were beginning to set an eye on this group of radical West Africans who begin to spread their influence in the North. Because Nkrumah was a brilliant guy. You know, he made his own mistakes, but he was very brilliant. So his idea was he knew very well that the conservatives were a hindrance to his radical ideology, to his transformation of Africa, the way he wants it. Nkrumah had a vision beyond Africa. I mean, beyond Ghana. His vision transcends Ghana. He wanted a unification of Africa to be able to fight the colonial superpowers. But the conservative blocs was against him because the conservatives were being funded by the West. They were the puppet masters, like little dogs. They're the bitches of the Western people, right? So because they were in the pocket of the Western society, Nkrumah saw them as a threat. So Nkrumah was then began to look for his like-minded leftist radical to form a greater alliance to be able to suppress these conservative people who were aligning themselves to the Western imperialists, right? So, and because of that, I'm going to tell you how CIA and the Western power elites and intelligentsia moved so quickly. And that's how they created what you call now the um, initially called the OAU, the Organization of African Union. Africans think they were the ones who created it. It was CIA covert operation, but we come to that later, right? So he utilized his presidential, okay. In 1961, Sekou Toure led a conference of radical leftist movement revolutionary under the name the Casablanca Group held in Morocco. President Eisenhower of America was very worried about the radical leftist movement in West Africa, particularly. He utilized his presidential lackey in Liberia, William Tubman. You know, there's something about Liberia. Liberia has always been a puppet country of America because it was America who founded that country. And that was why the capital is named Monrovia after President Monroe of America, because initially Liberia was created as a home for the slaves who want to leave the North America and go back to Africa. You know, these people didn't know particular region of Africa they came from. So after emancipation, the U.S. created Liberia as a country for the slaves to return. And from that moment, United States has been controlling Liberia ever. In fact, the so-called creation of Liberia for the slaves to go back is because America saw the future and they created a colony in Africa, literally. And that is why the CIA dominated Voice of America. You know, everybody listened to Voice when I was growing up in secondary school back home in Africa. Everybody listened to VOA, Voice of America, Washington, not knowing that that is a tool of cultural mind programming of the people by the CIA establishment. And the relay station of that radio station was in Liberia. So Liberia was like the relay power, strategic power planning center for the American government intelligence, right? And that's how they so manipulated that country to disaster up to now. But I don't know when Africans are going to wake up to some of these things. So let's continue. President Eisenhower was very worried about the radical leftist movement in West Africa, and particularly he utilized his presidential lackey, William Tubman, who was the president of Liberia, to neutralize the Ghana-Guinea-Mali alliance and the rise of the Casablanca Group. America used their puppet, William Tubman of Liberia, to form another group to counteract the Ghana-Guinea-Mali alliance, as well as the Casablanca Group that were mainly dominated by they were mainly the leftist movement in Africa. So William Tubman was a right winger. He was a conservative, right, loved by the West. So the West utilized him to neutralize the influence of Kwame Nkrumah and his leftist movement that wanted to say, today, all the imperialists will leave, all the colonialists will leave, and absolute total detachment from African, meddling into African affairs. The West did not like it, and they used this guy called William Tubman to create the Monrovia Group. You know, divide and conquer. Africans, what are you guys going to learn? Divide and conquer. You're fighting amongst yourself to, you don't know that the power that is controlling you is outside of you, right? So William Tubman, as I say, is a lackey of the American government. He's a puppet of the American government, right? The US government founded and supported Tubman to form a counter-alliance to counteract the Ghana-Guinea-Mali alliance, as well as the Casablanca Group. In 1961, Tubman formed the Monrovia Group. He used, what was I writing here? Well, his group comprised of moderate conservative African leaders. So now Tubman formed another group called the Monrovia Group. And I will tell you later, it was from this Monrovia Group that the OAU, or Organization of African Unity, which today is called the African Union, emerged. So it was William Tubman, who was funded and supported by the American CIA, who actually initiated this movement to neutralize the leftist Kwame Nkrumah's influence. So because CIA funded it, William Tubman's counter group was more massively spread. It comprised many people. So let's read. The Monrovia Conference outperformed the Casablanca group in participation. Participants include Central African Republic, Congo Brazzaville, Cameroon, Chad, Dahomey, which is Benin Republic today, Gabon, Mauritania, Madagascar, Ethiopia, Togo, Somalia, Upper Volta, which Thomas Sankara later renamed as Burkina Faso, the land of the upright man, Tunisia, Nigeria, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. So you see, initial formation of Kwame Nkrumah comprised of only few countries of the leftist movement. But when CIA supported William Tubman to form the Monrovia Group, you see that the influence of this Monrovia Group outperformed the Casablanca Group. I mean, the Kwame Nkrumah leftist movement. And that's how they suppressed Kwame Nkrumah. You know, CIA, trust them. So now in 19, remember, the first leftist movement in Africa started in 1958. And then in 1961, we see the Casablanca Group. And then I think, let's go back a little bit. William Tubman, what year was that? He's not here. Okay. Yeah, in 1961, William Tubman formed the Monrovia Group. 2 years later, what happened? Boom, OAU was formed. CIA inspired, dominated by majority of conservatives, right? Now CIA won, and African leaders today will be going to to OAU. I mean, today it's called the African Union, but in those days were called the OAU. And you see African leaders going there speaking big grammars and big English. They think that was the initiative. No, it was CIA, the central. Trust those people. They have resources, and they can go to any length to do anything. So the CIA's covert operation created OAU, 1963. Following the Liberian Conference of William Tubman. As I say, William Tubman has always been a puppet of the CIA, so they backed him to form the conservative based, so that the West will continue to have influence, because they know when Kwame Nkrumah's influence spread all over Africa, it's going to be difficult for the West. And again, at that point, the West was so worried about communism that through this leftist movement, the communist Russia were going to come in and dominate the entire African country, and then they would cut off the geopolitical strategic interest of the United States. They didn't want that to happen. Remember, at this time also, Russian influence was all over Africa. Most African leaders were turning to Russia, were heading to Russia, getting support, getting education from the West. So it's not just the West that has strong influence in Africa. Even some researchers will tell you that the Ghana, Guinea, Mali Alliance and the Casablanca group of the leftists were sponsored by the Russian secret intelligence agency, right? Some researchers will tell you that. So, yeah. Now let's identify some of the conservative African leaders that Western society used to, we are very at ease with. some of these conservative leaders who were pro-West, if you may. They talked independence talk and freedom for African talk, but fundamentally, the West were very at peace with them because they were non-radical, right? So the West can work with them, and the West prefer them to the so-called radical leftist socialist group leaders. Some of them are Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Was conservative, and the West loved him. And if you see all this regalia, if you understand the secret society, you see that it seems that he has all this. They gave him all these medals and symbol, this regalia, and this costume he's wearing seems like a very secret society. So if Haile Selassie was a Freemason, he wasn't working for you Africans, right? He wasn't working for you. He was working for his masters. And when they give you these titles and these medals, Mandela received the same thing. That's why they neutralized Mandela from quote unquote his radicalism and then make him so dumbed down that he just becomes so docile. I think the Mandela that went to prison was not the Mandela that came out. The Mandela that came out, the West could handle him. The one that went to prison initially, the West could not handle him. So something happened to him. Either the intelligence agency kind of really brainwashed, because brainwashing is a fact. Brainwashing and MK Ultra mind programming, mind conditioning is an advanced technique to really make people change their mind and control people, literally control people. And they utilize all these techniques on people. So something must have done to Mandela in prison. When he came out, it was a different. He got rid of his wife, who was a strong, one of his strongest backer. Got rid of him after he came out of prison, right? So Haile Selassie was one of the conservatives in Africa, right? And as I say, if you look at this, what he's wearing, it looks like a Freemasonic stuff. This cross and all this looks like. And if he's part of Freemason, the Illuminati, the secret society, control him. And of course, no wonder the OAU first formation was in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. Again, another conservative, Philibert Tsiranana. I don't know if I'm saying this correct. Another conservative. I think the first president of Madagascar. You see him again, the white people giving him all this medal. This medal always signifies, sometimes mostly signifies the Masonic, Freemason. So if this guy is a Freemason, he's not working for you Africans, he's a lackey. He is a puppet, he's a bitch of the Western power elite, power establishment of the Illuminati, of the global internationalist elite. So he wasn't working for you. He wasn't working for you. See, they're giving him the medal. The medal they go all over collecting. You see, a Freemason. These are some of you who like to do research, we dig more into this, because if he's a Freemason, he's not working for you, he's working for the diabolical, satanic, evil, Luciferian organization or people, internationalist, right? So he's one of the African conservative, right? So again, another conservative is the Moroccan King Hassan, another conservative in Africa. The West, we are at peace with him. Of course, he's a king. Who is a king who would like a left-wing radical? No, they wouldn't like it, because once left-wing radicalism incepts, it comes in, they're going to be the end of their kingdom. So it makes sense why this king of Morocco was a conservative. And you see, behind him is the Moorish flag and the Moorish star. It's kind of cut off, but you can see the Moorish star here. So another conservative in Africa that the West was usually at peace with. Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta was a conservative, although he did not start as a conservative with conservatism. He started as a radical Mao Zedong type communist revolutionary, but something happened to his psyche along the way, and he became more moderate. He became more conservative. So He was a very popular politician in Africa in those days, during his time, very popular, died in 1978, right? Again, this guy, Senghor, Seda Senghor, Leopold Seda Senghor of Senegal, right, is very popular. If you read literature and philosophy, you see that this guy is very popular in Africa, right? Because he was not just a politician, he was a kind of intellectual elite. And he is the one who proposed negritude. Negritude has to do with African consciousness, embracing African consciousness, the value of African. But many people will tell you that this guy is a hypocrite. He's a hypocrite. He's a francophone puppet boy of the French elite because he proposed negritude. Some people say he married a Western woman. He married a white lady, you know? And he's talking of African consciousness. People will tell you, what African consciousness is he talking? Is that you couldn't find a beautiful black woman in Africa to marry? And if you have married a European woman, how can you be talking of African soul, African consciousness? You know, you couldn't talk about that because he didn't know what he was talking about. So he wrote a lot extensively about this negritude. And we also have to understand that the French Francophone colonization was kind of very tricky because they have this policy of assimilation. Assimilation means that these people are funny. They're funny. They assimilate you into the French culture. So you see these elite politicians and intellectuals who are more French than they were Africans, right? They were more French than they were Africans, and they are talking of African liberation. You know, this guy, I think, when he retired, he went to France to live. He couldn't even live in Senegal, right? So we studied him a lot in secondary school. His poetry is a brilliant writer and used this critical social theory to write about African situation. So another very staunch conservative that the French political elite love him so much. And when the Western world love you as a leader, it means because you are doing their bidding for them. You are their agent. You are a conduit for them to exploit your people. When they don't like you, it means that you're blocking their way towards exploitation of your own people. So another strong voice, this guy is one of the strongest voice for the conservative bloc in Africa. Felix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast, or the place we call Cote d'Ivoire, right? He was a kind of cool, calm guy, but he was a staunch conservatism, and Kwame Nkrumah hated him. Kwame Nkrumah did not like him. Modibo Keita did not like him. Sekou Touré did not like him because these were in the liberal, Leninist, socialist, left-wing bloc. So I see him also wearing that cross. And if he is a Freemason, is another research I have to do. Is this guy a Freemason? I'm seeing a star here. If he's a Freemason, Africans, he wasn't working for you. He was working for his puppet masters, you know. If he was a Freemason, he was working for his puppet masters. Another guy is Kamazu Banda of Malawi. Kamazu Banda of Malawi, the late Prime Minister of Malawi, right? Another conservative that the West love, you see, is also having that cross. So these leaders, are they Freemason? Are they in the secret society called the Freemason? If they are Masonic, they are Luciferians. They are against everything you stand for. They are working for the dark side, working for you. So did this is that the reason why the Western elite love these people? Is another research that people have to do. Seretse Khama, Botswana, a conservative, conservative from 1966 to 1980. Seretse Khama, he married a European woman, right? Of course, that will tell probably why he will not be so harsh on the European colonialists at that time, because he married a European woman and is like one of those anglicized or francophonized, there's anything like that, francophonized. I love that terminology. So maybe that's partly why he too became a conservative. He's married to a European woman and they could not be harsh to his masters. So Tafawa Balewa, a very calm, collective Nigerian first prime minister. Is that first prime minister? Yeah, the first prime minister of Nigeria. He was killed in 1966 coup d'etat. That eventually, the whole drama eventually led to civil war in Nigeria. He's a conservative, of course, as a Muslim. It's predictable he might be a conservative. So the West love him. Is a darling of the Western society. Didn't have that much education, but it was cool. I think he only have a certification, maybe 1 year studies in some certification in kind of teaching, kind of education. So the West loved him, and he's a conservative, one of those conservative that Kwame Nkrumah detested. Kwame Nkrumah did not like them. And there was a saying, there was some scholars and historians who say that Kwame Nkrumah sponsored a coup that led to the demise of Sylvester Olympus of Togo? I think Togo. That was when some of these conservative African leaders begin to be afraid and begin to work with CIA into forming a different conservative bloc to counterize this quote-unquote radical movement in the African continent. So now those in the militant leftist Marxist-Leninist bloc or camp, who are they? Those people that the Western society detested and the CIA sought for their demise. Not just CIA, but other Western intelligent communities didn't like them. Who are they? Of course, Kwame Nkrumah, Marxist leftist inspired political ideology. Its political ideology was inspired by leftist Leninism, although he did not claim to be a Marxist. He did not claim to be a communist. He identified himself with socialism, but when you read the core of his philosophy, you see that Nkrumah was inspired by Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, their revolution, right? He tried to merge African ideology with Marxist ideology, Leninist ideology, and then came out with his version called version of socialism. You see him interacting with who? Who is here? Fidel Castro, the communist Cuban revolutionary. See, having picture with Fidel Castro, and this them standing together like this will make the Western world go crazy. Will make the Western society go crazy. CIA will be all over you. Fidel Castro was an arch enemy of the United States. They wanted to get rid of him for a long time. I think they've tried how many assassinations? Multiple assassinations, failed assassinations on him. So they didn't want him because he's a Marxist, Leninist revolutionary. And at that time, you're talking of the Cold War between the East and the West, between communism and capitalism. Again, another radical in the Black Book of the Western Society is Samora Michael. He's a Marxist-Leninist political revolutionary. See him again. Who is taking picture with? Who is he taking picture with? Castro, Fidel Castro, Cuba, the radical Marxist communist revolutionary, right? And that is why I say that African leaders did not have a political platform that is indigenous. They borrow from here and they borrow from there, and they got distracted. And because they are borrowing from the East and from the West, they are often manipulated by these two ideological camps, right? Who again Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea-Bissau. No, Guinea-Bissau. Yes, Guinea-Bissau. His political ideology was inspired by Marxist-Leninism. Again, so most of these pre-colonial, pre-independence, post-independence leaders were dabbling in communist ideologies of Mao Zedong, of Karl Marx, of Vladimir Lenin, right? So him again, who did you see him picture here? With Fidel Castro. And for some of you who may want to know, Castro was very influential in Africa pre and post independence era. Castro was very strong, and in fact, many African leaders loved him in West Africa as well as in southern part of Africa. They loved him so much because Africa was looking for anything that could liberate them, and they saw Marxist revolutionary as that ideal platform, as that ideal background, that ideal tool with which they will liberate themselves from the imperial West, right? And they're willing to listen to anyone who will free them from the Western society. But the problem is that they begin to not understand what communism means. That communism is also a very repressive political economic ideology that is often counterproductive to a society, right? Communism for me is anti-humanity, humanity because individual freedom is extinguished. A person does not exist. The state is the god or the demigod. And you can do whatever. The state can sacrifice you on the altar of his achievement. You don't have a voice. And I'm not saying that capitalism is the best. Capitalism has its own error. These two ideologies, they have their own intrinsic errors, right? But what I'm trying to say, I'm trying to state the fact that African leaders did not really study these ideologies. They embraced this ideology from a very superficial catchphrase kind of manner. And that led to them collapsing because this guy was fought again by the Western society, did not like him. Modibo Keita of Mali, right? Another leftist, leftist in the African continent. The West did not like him as well. Jamal Abdel Nasser Hussein of Egypt. Some people consider him as a leftist as well. Let's go back. Who did this guy, you see the picture, him with who? With who? Fidel Castro. With the pretty boy, Fidel Castro. He was with Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro is a communist. So you see why the Western society and CIA worked assiduously to make sure that they dismantle these African leaders, right? So that led to these African leaders having covert operations to destroy them, to destabilize them by any means necessary. And they did. Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria. Again, he was inspired by Marxist collectivism, right? You see him captured with who again? His picture is here with who? Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, revolutionary Marxists in South America, Cuba. Who again? The strong man of Africa, Robert Mugabe. I think Mugabe is very funny. It's very funny. Okay. Underpinning his political philosophy was revolutionary Marxist-Leninism, especially as espoused by Mao Zedong of China. Explains why he allied with the Chinese. The Chinese loved him because he embraced the Chinese version of communism, of Marxist revolution, as preached and practiced by Mao Zedong of the Communist Chinese Revolution, right? And again, see him here with who? Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro. And you see that this guy was again enemy of the West. It was in the black book of the West. The West could have killed him, blown his head off if they could. They didn't like him. So when I'm trying to make people see a pattern coming together, that the reason the Western society were so antagonistic and so sabotaging of African independence movement and leaders was because they saw them as part of the Cold War between the East and the West. So they are fighting this global war. And they saw these African leaders as part of the communist system that they want to dismantle by any means necessary. This guy, Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, right? No, Guinea-Bissau, yes. Who is he captured here with? Fidel Castro, you know? I think this guy was assassinated. I don't remember. I think he was assassinated. Was kind of leftist as well, radical, who dabbled into this Leninist. Oh my goodness. Leninism and Marxism was very strong in Africa in those days. In those days, it was because I know that Russia was also accepting some African students into Russian institutions to study medicine, to study political philosophy, and they will come back and they begin to have these political ideologies, and then they became the target of the West. And what happens is that the CIA will um, fund and sponsor people within your inner caucus. They will not come directly to kill you, but they will use people around you to kill you, whether it is in terms of coup or counter coup or poison you. They will do that. They will take you out. Not because this killing you is inspired locally, but because it's a war between the East and the West. That's how things work. Again, Eduardo Mondlane of Mozambique, leftist radical according to the West, who is he pictured here with? Che Guevara, the Marxist Leninist revolutionary. So I don't remember what I think this guy must have been killed. I don't remember that. But this guy, Said Barre, I don't know if I'm saying this name right. Again, this guy was a conservative Muslim in the beginning. He was very conservative, but then his country, Somalia, was engaged in a war, I think, with Ethiopia. I think with Ethiopia. So the country was engaged in a war, and then Ethiopia was, is it Ethiopia? I'm trying to see, I think Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was aligned to the West. So what happened? He got frustrated and turned to the Soviet Union, turned to Russia. So he became a Marxist Leninist ideology and a strong advocate of that ideology, political and economic ideology for that matter, right? So now, these two blocks, leftist, Leninist, communist, socialist, Lenin leaders in Africa, as well as the other bloc, the conservative right wing, are not the only ones we see in Africa. We also see the moderate reformists who want to genuinely reform. They're not saying white people have to leave, or they're just saying that Africa has to be for Africans, but it's a gradual process of internal re-examination and reformation. And these are represented by the likes of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. He's one of those, is in the middle, is not extremely conservative, not extremely radical, just in the middle. They want reform from within African, right? Kind of moderate. As Buddha will say, virtue lies in the middle course, in the middle. Don't do too extreme. So these are these kind of people. And then Tom Mboya of Kenya, I think he was assassinated. One of the brightest, very intelligent, young, dynamic, charming. He had. I like this guy. When you read his background and his history, I like him. And he was killed. He was assassinated. A very intelligent, younger Kenyan politician, Tom Mboya. Right? Milton Obote, another kind of reformist in the middle, not radical, not extremely conservative, just in the middle. I think this guy was the one that Idi Amin Dada displaced in power, and he went into exile and became poor and miserable. So was in that camp as well. And then Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia, another moderate. I'm seeing him again with this medal. Is he a Freemason? And I used to say, if he's a Freemason, he's not working for you Africans. Julius Nyerere, you know, Nyerere, is an agrarian kind of politician, agrarian reformer. He's a man of the people. He's for the grassroots people. I think he was a popular name in Africa in those days as well. You see him again was captured here with who? Fidel Castro. And Castro, communist philosophies and ideologies and propaganda were all over Africa. Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, another reformist, not too radical, not too conservative, just moderate. We want reform, right? So we've come to the end of this slide, and this is just kind of a pictograph of some of the reasons that African leaders did not meet up the expectation of the promises of independence, because there were war going on a global level called the Cold War. And this Cold War, Africa became the battleground. The Eastern communism was trying to, as well as the Chinese communist spies, and were trying to get hold of Africa. And the Western society were also trying to get their piece of their geographic, of their geostrategic political interest in Africa. And that became the problem for the African leaders, because African leaders were confused. Am I turning east? You know, am I turning east? I'm turning west. And in either side you turn, the elite, the establishment there, the intelligentsia there will manipulate you for their own interest. And that's how African leaders were completely manipulated on both sides through their affiliations with these different political ideologies, be it communism or capitalism. None of them at that point was good for Africa, because the puppet masters of this internationalist did not want African to emerge as strong and as powerful. And that led to the demise of many African leaders, including Kwame Nkrumah, and those people who they consider as radical reformists. I hope African leaders will begin to learn that who pays the pipe dictates the tune. When you align yourself with some of these global superpowers, now the Chinese government is spreading all over Africa, and Africans are signing truce and agreements with these communist Chinese imperialism, new soft imperialism, through their philosophy of one belt, one road. They are beginning to come back to Africa and to recolonize and reconquer the entire African country and siphon the resources of the African continent, while the leaders seem to be trapped in their imbecilic ignorance, not knowing that China, as soft as they are, will be endemic, will be inimical to the African intrinsic development. The loans that are given to you Africans will not be free. We pay for it. Your children and children will pay for it, unless you realize that you begin to think for yourself. Because around the world, African leaders, you're not seen as capable of reasoning. You're not seen as capable of philosophy, of thinking, of engineering, of technology. You're not seen as capable of any of those things. You're seen as capable only for one thing. You're a beggar. A beggar. And have some little shame. If you beg people a lot, you don't have shame. Subscribe to my channel. This is the Primordial Wave.